this speech had three elements to it, Trump's State of the Union. Number one was fluff, just cultural trigger words for the right wing. National anthem, flag, God, country, family.
MS-13.
That's another part of the speech. Yeah. Religious liberty, Second Amendment, veterans, 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 God, God, God. Okay, that's benign. It's okay. That's how they, what does the right wing call that? Virtue signaling, in essence. And so, okay. Then the second part was the demagoguery. Boy, he laid it on thick. So he took two poor families whose daughters had been killed, and then when talking about the MS-13 gang members who had killed him, apparently, he called them illegal, unaccompanied alien minors who had come in, an obvious reference to the Dreamers. So the Dreamers have usually had a very positive connotation here in America because they've never broken any laws, otherwise they're not in that category. They're going to college, going to the military. They've done the right things. There's about 800,000 of them at least in the initial batch of Dreamers that are addressed. But instead of taking those positive connotations, he turned it into the ugliest thing you could imagine. And he used, in a sense, emotional porn to do it. He took these family members who it's impossible not to feel grave concern over and great empathy for. And he used their grief to push his demagoguery against millions of people in this country. And then talked about how ICE is gonna hunt people down. Look, we've always been against people who broke the law and who committed crimes and obviously who committed murder. Obama was against that, Bush, Clinton, everyone has always been against that. In fact, there is a guy in office who's against the rule of law. It's Donald Trump, trying to dismantle the FBI. But to then connect those people to the Dreamers was particularly loathsome.
You know, I mean, never in a million years would, because it doesn't work this way. That's not how race works, right? But imagine if he'd put up a picture of the guy from Vegas, right? And said, you know, and here is another, he brought up these families and suggested that we are in danger from private white male gun owners, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, and we would never, that's not, again, racism doesn't work that way. You do it by picking out a minority. But there's no more likelihood that a Dreamer is gonna kill your family than anyone else. But he has decided to associate this grief, or chosen to associate this grief with sort of these latent feelings that we have that, oh, people who are different, people who are not like us are gonna come and they're gonna get us.
So I think that portion of his speech certainly comes from the Stephen Millers of the world, because if you poll Trump voters, if you poll his core base, even a slim majority of his voters are in favor of the protections for these Dreamers. If you look at the American public in general, of course, the majority, a larger majority, are in favor of protecting them. So, you know, that was pandering to the Stephen Miller wing of his supporters, and who knows how it's going to work. But to conflate, like to compare or say that, you know, MS-13 and some of the murders that have occurred as a result of these gang members has anything to do with Dreamers is just.
And I think you're right about the Stephen Miller point. I just want to point out that it's not like Stephen Miller has to talk a guy like Trump into that.
Right.
That's Trump.
Exactly.
That's what he believes. Since day one, since 1983. This is what he believes. This is his view of life.
And one other important line that I think we have to acknowledge is that he kept talking about MS-13 and all that, and then he tried to equate them as if they are what a Dreamer is, and then said, and Americans are Dreamers too.
Yes, that's
saying to everyone in the audience and in the room, you now get to choose between these Dreamers and the Americans that they are dead set on murdering.
The real Americans, that's right.
And John pointed out during the live show on Twitter, David Duke took that line about Americans are Dreamers too and said, thank you, Mr. President.
Right.
And so to Anna's point during the live play-by-play that we just did of the speech, you could focus on any group of people and talk about all the different heinous murders that they have committed. For example, recently on the show we talked about Atomwaffen. That is a particular neo-Nazi group that has led to a series of murders in different parts of the country, which is amazing. It does not get very much attention. He could have focused on that. He could have focused on the people in Charlottesville. There's a ton of people, the majority of the domestic terrorists in this country are right wing. He chose not to do that. He chose to mention MS-13 about 5 times.
Right.
And so it is a matter of emphasis. And so when he does that, he's trying to get you to hate a certain group. So now I wouldn't suggest that a liberal should go in the opposite direction and only talk about the neo-Nazis. You should talk about all the threats, the real threats that face the country. But when you get to the real threats, which leads us to the third portion, and by the way, I should also back up what Anna's saying on the numbers. Over 50% of Republicans are in favor of the Dreamers staying here, and 87% of Americans want them to have a pathway to citizenship. It is enormously popular. He demagogued against those people anyway. The third branch of what he talked about tonight was policy. So there wasn't a lot of policy with Trump because he's only done 2 things basically: the tax cuts and appointing Neil Gorsuch and other judicial nominees. So he talked about that. He showed a stone-faced Gorsuch, which was amusing.
Yeah.
And then he introduced some new policies, which is $1.5 trillion in infrastructure spending. If that was real, that would be great. And there's no reason not to work with Trump if he is doing progressive things. Like, for example, initially he was against TPP. Now he says he might re-enter it because he's going to make it a better deal. But great, I'm glad that he got out of TPP. I'd be happy with $1.5 trillion in infrastructure. But as we know, the plan in reality is privatizing our roads and bridges, so we have to pay tolls on them for the rest of our lives. That is, by the way, a redistribution of wealth, and it is a form of regressive taxes. They just gave a ton of tax cuts to the rich. They got to make up for it by taxing you guys whenever you drive anywhere. So that's part of what's happening. In terms of immigration, he talked about the 4 pillars. He wants $25 billion for his wall in exchange for the DREAM Act, and mentioned tighter security, and went on more rants about MS-13.
And just real quick, because you mentioned the $25 billion, everyone should every time say Mexico was going to pay for this. Like,
right, exactly.
I mean, it wasn't a passing campaign theme. There was no speech that he gave that he didn't talk about the wall that he didn't mention that Mexico is going to pay for.
Like, it's despicable that we don't have money to help out our fellow Americans with health care or with affording college and all of that. But we have $25 billion to give Trump for this ridiculous, nonsensical border wall. That should definitely be a talking point by Democrats, and they should be hounding him about that, but they're not.
So when Bernie Sanders said he wanted to do college for all, so that middle class kids could also go to school at a public college, they said it's wildly unrealistic because it costs $75 billion. So for the price of educating for free 1/3 of the young kids in America who want to go to college, said we're going to build a senseless wall. And then nobody talks about how, we don't have the money for it. Nobody talks about the $1.5 trillion we just gave to the rich in those tax cuts, saying we don't have the money for it. Of course we don't. What happened to balanced budgets?
And we had the money for it through 1960. I mean, we just did it.
Yeah.
Or for a nominal fee. You don't have to make it absolutely free. Yeah. You can make it pretty damn cheap.
So Bernie Sanders, it would be awesome if he hasn't spoken yet. He's about to, as we're covering this live. It would be great if he came out and said, "What happened? I thought the Mexicans were going to pay for the wall." Okay, yeah. That would be wonderful.
Let me mention something about Sanders too, because it adds a little perspective. First of all, Maxine Waters is also going to give a speech today on BET in response. So Joe Kennedy, Maxine Waters, Bernie Sanders, Donna Edwards is going to speak on the Working Families Party. Donna Edwards was a member of Congress. She ran for the Senate in 2016 in Maryland, a Democratic primary. She lost to Chris Von Hollen, who now has that seat. And there's one in Spanish also. Delegate Elizabeth Guzman of Virginia will give the speech. So for the Republicans in 2014, 4 GOP lawmakers gave a response to Barack Obama's speech. Kathy McMorris Rodgers gave the official response. Rand Paul and Mike Lee gave the Tea Party response, and then Ileana Ross-Leighton gave a Spanish response. So it's nothing unprecedented is happening here.
They're all creating disunity.
They were creating,
and they should all be attacked relentlessly on Twitter.
And which they are right now, but the Republicans were not equally.
And to some extent, although my initial response was Bernie should wait. Look, I'm very clear who I think the bad guy is in this situation. The bad guy is Donald Trump. The bad guys are the leaders in Congress.